You're live.
Thank you. Welcome to House Committee on General Housing, everyone. Today is Wednesday, right? I'm not sure. Wednesday, the last day of April. And we're hearing this morning S-127, which is the Senate analog to our housing bill. It's the housing bill. It's likely the vehicle. Hey, Joe, good morning. It's the vehicle that probably we will jointly use with the Senate to move this bill forward. As many of you know, but for those of you online, this bill is sufficiently complex that in fact it has had many hands in it. And one of the major pieces is the language associated with tax increment financing. And that, as has always been the case, has been primarily the work of the Commerce Committee. And Commerce Committee has been working on that piece and is essentially presenting it to us this morning, and it will become part of S-127, which we have possession of. And we will also, we will start off is hearing from Representative Marcotte and Representative Branning, the chair and the vice chair of the Commerce Committee, as they present this bill. Rumor has it that we actually may have John Gray, legislative counsel here, though that is always an iffy bet. We'll just have to see. And then we are going to commence taking testimony on a number of issues that are outstanding or that are there that were punted to us one way or another. And those issues include housing. For those of you who are witnesses, we'll do what we can this morning. And but we have set aside essentially plenty of time. We might do it after the floor. After the floor, we can continue taking testimony.
Have you reloaded the agenda?
I have now. And Nancy, we have two witnesses after the floor, and we'll just see how far we get this morning. So with that, I think everyone in the room is familiar with this committee. So Michael and Edie, please take it away.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to go over CHIP program with you. My name is Michael Marcotte. I'm a state representative from Coventry, and I chair House Commerce and Economic Development.
Edie Branning, Vice Chair of the Committee, representing Jericho and Unger.
So,
And good morning.
so I'll start by saying House Commerce and Economic Development spent, I think, the last 2 or 3 weeks, whenever this bill came over from the Senate, a majority of our time was spent taking testimony, having a lot of committee discussion, a lot of discussions with various members of the outside that wanted to talk to us about this. And what you have in front of you is language that represents some good, I think, good changes from what came over from the Senate. Our attempt was to put some guardrails around this program because we are talking about taxpayer dollars. And so we want to make sure, and this is a program for housing that will assist, I think, all our municipalities in being able to access CHIP program. Two things that are not in here yet, but we will work on next year, are improvement districts. So we're starting to have that conversation. We've heard from Michael Gahn from Bond Bank, has brought that to us. It's just late in session start looking at that. And we're also looking at, tax stabilization as another feature that we could add on to this. But again, not enough time, because that would have to be, I think, looked at by our committee and then by Ways and Means. And again, time is not in our favor right now. So those are two things that we will work on next year. I will say this is not a perfect bill. Until we have some data to better understand how this actually works on the ground. This is, I think, our best attempt at getting to perfection as much as possible. I'm not going to walk you through the bill. I'm going to leave that to John. But we can, the bill that you have in front of you is highlighted. And those highlights are the changes that we made to the what came over from the Senate. So when we look at the definitions on the housing development,
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Magali, is this draft now posted? And it's posted under today, under Michael Marcotte?
Under John.
Under John Gray. All right. For those online and who want to follow along. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
problem. So under subsection 5, at the bottom of the page, you'll see highlighted. So I think as it came over from the Senate, they just talked about construction. We heard a lot of testimony on, there's a lot of buildings out there that need to be rehabbed or renovated. We felt that should be part of the eligibility as well. I think we know that there's a lot of office buildings now that are vacant. There's also the possibility of school buildings may become vacant in the coming years, depending on what happens with our education system, that those buildings, should they be able to be renovated for housing, this should be available for those improvements that need to be done for infrastructure. And I think, on page 2, you'll see rehabilitation in subsection A and the 9A. As it came over from the Senate, they talked about transportation. We broke that down so that it's clear that we're talking about roads, bridges, sidewalks. That could be used as rehab improvements or improvements for the infrastructure. On page 5, we added a clause in here in G that determines that the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907. That's another reference to housing. And I think it's housing, all types of housing. So,
Low and moderate
yeah,
income.
right.
Can I build on this?
Yeah.
So when it came to us from the Senate, the only thing that really referenced the housing to be created was in the purpose. And so what we wanted to do was make sure that it wasn't only legislative intent, but there was language in the bill that required the housing to get built. And so you'll see, so we refer back to that purpose a number of times, so we don't have to repeat the language, but also to make it very clear and to make there be actual touch points that have to show that the housing is being built.
Is the purpose section in here?
Yeah, it's on previous page, lines 4 through 6. Page 4, lines 4 through 6.
And on page 6, subsection 4, we added this in. We had robust discussion about this. We want to make sure that within the application, within the agreement between the municipality and the sponsor, that within that agreement that they're going to provide the terms that ensure that any housing unit be offered is exclusively primary residences. That's why we're making this investment in CHIP. And we want to make sure that we're not allowing some investors to come in and purchase up some buildings and turn them into short-term rentals, or for someone to come in and purchase property that they can turn into a second home.
To question and just a thought. So is primary residence defined? Does it, okay, it's not defined here.
No.
Okay. It might not hurt for you to go up a few thousand feet. It's true that everyone in this committee sat through and enjoyed, I'm sure, a hearing, a joint hearing with you guys, but it's been a while. So it might help members of the committee. Okay, whatever that was. It might help members of the committee to talk about sort of how this works. You're referencing here the agreement. And excuse me a minute. Do we know what this is?
It's all right.
Oh, it's out there. Okay. It might help to describe a little bit how this works, what the agreement is. And I know we all had the concern that this be as easy as possible to administer for smaller communities, unlike the traditional TIF. So if it's okay with you, would you be willing to spend just a few minutes and describe that larger picture, and then we'll go back to this?
So the municipality, when they're working with the municipality can be the sponsor of a proposition and hire a developer. That could be a developer that could be the sponsor as well, or it could be someone sponsoring and then hiring a developer working with the municipality. The municipality can bond on their own. They have to go, there's a whole process for that. And they have to go through a process where they have to present that to the electorate. They have to vote on it, whether or not they would accept the bond. There's also the developer could finance it on their own, working with the municipality. So those would be in the agreement, the housing agreement. There are many different. We want to make sure that we're framing up the contract of what the minimum of what should be in the contract. It's not an exclusive. The municipality may add more. Municipality also may have zoning bylaws that need to be followed as well. So those are things that the municipality can work with either their legal counsel or with, as they're drawing the contract up and working with the sponsor on signing that contract. So in subsection 4, what we've added is to make sure that primary residence is there. I think some of the pushback that we received from Vermont League of Cities and Towns was that we're putting municipalities in a position where they can't ensure that all the properties will remain as primary residences until the bond is paid off or until the debt is paid off.
Question.
Can I just ask a really quick question? I'm assuming, a contractor who's going into this, the town agreements is gonna say, yes, I'm agreeing to keep this just primary residency. Did you all talk about what happens if it's not? Like, is there a fine associated? Is there any teeth to this?
That will be built into the contract.
Okay,
It's an agreement between the municipality and the sponsor. Those terms would have to be agreed to on how they determine how they keep these residences primary.
okay, perfect.
You'll also see further on that in a report that comes back from BEPC, that's something that they have to ask as well, and making sure that to the best of their ability to determine whether these residences are remaining primary residences.
they can require covenants, right? So if a developer, so
I
there are
just
lots
wanted
of.
to know
yeah.
if like,
But then
if
there's
for some
still-
reason we needed to talk more about that, but.
Yeah, I think there could be clawback in there, that the municipality could claw back some of the dollars that that the chip expended for that infrastructure. As a penalty, they could put something in there that there's a penalty that goes back to the municipality as well if they don't follow the contract. So I think that's all between the two parties that are contracting.
Perfect, thank you.
Just some technical corrections on page 7. On page 8. And when this came from the Senate, there were no, there was nothing in the bill that said how much housing you had to have. You could have accessed CHIP by building one residential unit. So it could be one apartment, could be an apartment above a retail store, could have been anything, and that's not what CHIP is proposing to do. CHIP is proposing to create housing. And so we had a lot of discussion on what the floor should be. We heard from David White from White and Berg. They proposed 40%. We talked with Maura Collins from BHFA. Maura said the floor should be at least 60% because this is housing. And so we settled, we agreed with Maura. We settled that at least 60% of the gross floor area is going to be projected as housing development. We also looked at the, we also.
Michael, I have a question here on this. Maybe don't hesitate till me. I'll wait till John comes, whenever that is. No, he's coming at 10. I'm teasing. So I get this. Is the definition of housing development or something clear enough that this wouldn't just mean that I, as a developer, would just modify? I would just divide my commercial and my residential and escape this.
I mean, you can ask John, certainly ask John that question. I think that the municipality has a stake in this. And then Betsy also has to look at this as well. So I think that's covered, especially with what Betsy has to look at. But I mean, you can certainly ask John that question.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Hi, good morning. I'm so sorry. I'm still driving in. I had car issues. I was curious whether there was a specific reason that back when you were discussing the infrastructure that would qualify, you said that you narrowed down transportation as defined as roads and bridges. And I was just wondering whether that was due to testimony or a specific reason, and why it excluded something like public transit facilities or, walkability or a bike lane. If you, or maybe that's contained within the definition and I just misheard.
It is contained within the definition, Leonora. It was listed as transportation infrastructure, but it was not as clear as roads, bridges, sidewalks, parking, public facilities and amenities, so we tried to enumerate it so that it was more clear. And the current TIF district is listed as transportation, and is a helipad something that's probably not, right? So we just wanted it to be a little more clear.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And I think, there's also rulemaking that Betsy will have to do. And I think some of that a lot of this will get fleshed out in the rulemaking process as well. Because we went to a 60% gross floor area for projects, a minimum. We also heard testimony why we shouldn't do that is because there could be projects that come before Betsy that do not meet 60%, but are projects that could be beneficial to a community. Where they might meet 50%, but it could be that they have business that requires a larger workforce. And without having that project go forward, it could be detrimental to that business that's there. And so in order to accomplish that proposal to be at least heard and looked at, we created a board. We didn't feel that we wanted to put that on Betsy. So we talked with, had discussions with Maura and talked about the LIAC board that the treasurer has. It's an advisory board that he has for the 10% that is invested around Vermont. And we use that as a template. And so we talked about who should, well, it's referenced here. So
It's
referenced on subsection 2, D2 on page 8.
yeah.
And so I think we'll go right through it with you, how that whole board works. Yeah.
Really quick question. Did you talk, and I've been like trying to go in between and watch your committee and be there when I can. Did you take any testimony or did you talk about maybe along with, or, you know, if for some reason Betsy is busy, getting like a sign off letter from RPCs?
The RPCs have a seat on the Betsy board.
Thank you. Oh, wait.
So we felt that this new board creation would be the treasurer. The treasurer is the chair. Treasurer's office also provides administrative support to the.
It's on page 21 if you want to look at it. We're just jumping.
Yeah, we're jumping ahead.
That's okay.
Because it's referenced. But then we have VITA, VHFA, VLCT, and the bond bank. So those five members make up the board. And what we're envisioning is that when an application comes into Betsy, and they will know right away that if it meets or does not meet the 60%. If it does not meet the 60%, we're hoping that Betsy will transmit that to this new board. And that when they hold a hearing on the application, that Betsy holds that the new board, the new CHIP board, will also sit with them. So we don't want a redundant application process where first they go to Betsy, denied, then they turn around and go to the CHIP board. That these should be able to function all at the same time. We don't envision this new board to be in service very much. We think that most projects are going to strive to meet at least the 60% threshold.
One last question. Because this board is made up of stakeholders and really where housing is, you know, their objective, their job, there's no appropriation to this board, correct?
No.
So it's kind of like a variance, sort of
Exactly.
a variance from, well, at least this section. But it could be other.
No,
No, it's just this one.
it's just, yeah. We just want to make sure that there's objective eyes that are looking at a project. And making sure that it meets the goals of housing. There could be some projects that won't pencil out without some
Right.
retail or some commercial in the bottom floors. But we have also heard in testimony that there are a lot of vacant commercial properties on main streets right now. And so it may behoove developers to create housing that is from first floor all the way up to second or third floors. That could then spur those empty commercial spaces to be occupied because there's more people that are there. So
Yes.
I'm not gonna say this is my last question because apparently it's not going to be. What you had just said kind of made me think of the 60%, 40%. Is there a definition of square footage of housing? Like, so if you have a stairwell on your first floor of a commercial, is that considered that the square footage in the stairwell is housing?
all the square footage is considered.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
It uses FAR, right? Floor area ratio.
Yes.
Or floor area, it just uses floor area, right? So that's gross floor area. Okay.
So that's pretty much the reasoning for the board and how the board functions. I think now if we go back to page 9, we're talking about location criteria. When we look at the new language that's on 9, that actually is talking about tier 2. And so right now, tier 2 hasn't been developed yet. But there are areas in that are possibly tier 2 areas that may already have an Act 250 permit. So that means that there's 10 or more housing units that are proposed to go in that area. And so we're saying that if they already have their Act 250 permit, then they could access CHIP to help bring that to as part of the stack to get it off the ground and pencil out.
I think I need to delve down just a little deeper in that to understand it. So if it's tier 1A or 1B, that goes. It goes in, right? I mean, it's okay.
That's eligible for
Yeah,
CHIP.
right.
Can I back it up just a
Yeah.
little bit? So right now, the way the definitions are, anything that's not tier 1 or tier 3 is tier 2. And since tier 1 and tier 3 aren't going to be defined until 2026, the whole state is tier 2. So we couldn't just leave in here tier 2 is eligible. We had to say these areas are eligible or these areas are not eligible until the maps are defined. And so we really had to think about this really critically, what was added, what was not, and how it made sense.
So this is an area where my knowledge is somewhat incomplete.
We're right along with you.
As I understand it, tier 1, do I understand it correctly, in that tier 1A and tier 1B are preliminarily mapped?
I don't,
They're mapped for purposes of interim exemptions from
there are interim exemptions
Those
to
interim
cover those areas.
those areas, and they are preliminarily mapped, and you can go on a map on state website and see whether you're in tier 1A or 1B. We know that the mapping process that's underway and will be done next year may change.
So
1A and 1B.
1B is going to take a municipality to request it, and those areas have not even been requested yet. The way to request it has not fully been developed yet.
Right,
So 1A is different from 1B, and 1A is, yeah, so I would say don't count on any of that until 2026.
okay. So when it says here below, just try to see the structure of this, location criteria. To determine whether the housing development site is located within the following, one of the following areas. Then you skip down to 1, an area designated 1A or 1B. Or an area exempt. So that's 1A, that's this preliminary 1A and 1B.
Exactly.
Okay. So then, in addition, in this provided however, or provided above. Forgive me, I'm just going through this because I want to just nail it down here. If regardless of where it is, or just only in tier two. Somewhere, a housing development that's gotten all permits. And that includes Act 250.
Top of page 9. That's
Yeah.
what that is.
That's what that is.
Yep.
Is that what 151 is?
Yes.
Okay, so it's gotten all permits at the time of its application.
Yes.
So does this mean let's say I have, as a hypothetical, which is not all that hypothetical. Let's say I'm not currently mapped for what it's worth in tier 1B. I mean, the mapping is preliminary. But I'm near it or right at it. Nearby. And I go ahead and apply for an Act 250 permit. And I get it. I could then apply for financing.
So if you're near a 1B.
Yeah.
But not.
Say
quite
not in it, yeah.
It could be also, there's the existing settlement area,
Oh, right,
so that's exempt as well.
right. So if it's exempt or an area exempt. So that's within a certain distance of the,
Correct.
of
So
one
if
B.
you're outside of that half mile,
That's right,
then-
it's half a mile.
then and if you have secured your permits, Act 250 permits, because you're required, if you're doing 10 or more units to get an Act 250 permit, then you could access the chip.
Supposing that my project is 5 units. It would also be in here as well. If I get all I wouldn't need an Act 250 permit, but if I've gotten all my other permits.
And your town and your municipality
Yeah.
has an agreement with the developer to do.
Yeah.
All of that, yes, all of that is.
So
Well,
if you're, but
only with
you
their access to money.
can't access in the tier 2. If you do not have an Act 250 permit, you cannot access chip until 2028. The trigger is the Act 250. For access in the tier 2 area. So no matter where you are.
Right,
if you're
provided that
1A, 1B,
housing
existing
development.
settlement, you have to have your permits from your municipality.
Sure,
And it has to, meet your town plan, has to meet the regional plan, but you're exempt from Act 250. What we're saying here is if you're outside of all of those boundaries and you have secured an Act 250 permit, which is 10 or more housing, then you can access CHIP.
if you're smaller than
If
that,
you're smaller, then you have to wait until 2028.
and what happens in 2028?
So from the time that CHIP starts till that time, the mapping will be done. We'll better understand where the tier 2 and where, and within tier 2, where those settlement areas could be.
Right,
And at that time, that's when we will come back in again and and add more language to that tier 2 so that we can fold tier 2 in as well. And also it gives Ways and Means the opportunity to take a look at what's been going on with tier 1, tier 2 existing settlements to find out how much access has been had at that point, to get more data, to have a better idea of how it's affecting the ed fund.
okay, thank you. Any questions on this so far, just in terms of these? I think what we're focusing on here is what's the intent of the Commerce Committee on these issues, and so I'm sure that they would like to be interrupted if you want to interrupt them and ask more questions.
I'll add that the mapping is much more detailed than area 1 A, 1B, tier 2, and tier 3. Within all of those areas, the mapping has, declared things as agricultural or rural or agriculture, all of these. So I think what we really want to see, our hope is to see like what areas are, how those areas are designated. And then once we see that when it's done, we can come back and say, the certain areas are eligible within tier 2 and certain areas need extra support in order to become eligible. So that we're building housing where we want housing to be built in the state. And we have a statewide plan for that. And how do we continue to reinforce that and in all of the different ways that we can statewide?
So it's okay if it's in here two. If it's got an Act 250 permit, and I understand what you just said, that your goal is that in 2028, before 2028, we'll revisit this, and it is our understanding that the mapping is on schedule. Is that your understanding as well? But just in terms of what's here, what happens in 2020? Where is the 2028?
It's at the end of the bill.
Okay, we'll
It's
get
at the end of
We'll get to
the
it.
language.
All right.
So
I have a quick question. I apologize for having been late, so this may have been addressed already, but will there be any point at which the mapping includes the education, what comes out of the education transformation bill?
So
But-
the mapping is from from Act 181 last year, so it's specifically just the state mapping of like designated areas, wastewater, everything we worked on, so there wouldn't be anything to map in
Okay,
conjunction with whatever comes out.
I guess I'm voicing concern over the potential of closing a lot of schools
Different maps.
and what?
I think they're two different maps.
I'm just saying what my concern is,
Yeah.
which is that the closure of a lot of schools and the planning of a lot of housing.
Where
And
do they-
not coordinating those.
where does it fall in?
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's something we need to look at when everything sugars off, right? And this isn't, this is just this is the start. And I
Yeah.
think as we roll forward with everything that's going on, that we start adding to this and looking at what's going on in the education field. If those buildings fall outside of a 1A or 1B, are they in a tier 2? I think most of them are probably in a 1A or 1B. They're generally always close to a designated area for the town anyway. But if they happen to fall out, how do we fold them in if the municipality wants to turn those into housing units? And I think that's something that we all need to remember and keep in the back of our minds as we're going forward. I think the next change that we've had is the use of tax increments on page 14 in the retention period. And so we just added language there that we want to make sure that the municipality can provide to a sponsor that they have to provide an invoice, a receipt, an invoice, just to prove that they've actually, if they're the one that has taken on the indebtedness of the developer or the sponsor, that they provide an invoice, just assuring that they have spent the money and that this money is due to them.
Is this Doug Hoffer? I know Doug testified before you, and I read his testimony for his letter, which was, of course, critical. But one of it was that just misappropriation of funds. A history of misappropriation of education funds, et cetera. Is this one of the ways in which you're trying to tighten that up, or is it something else?
I think whoever is gonna audit, and I think once a year, everything has to be audited anyway, it's just creating a trail, an audit trail. Making sure that the money is being spent the way it's supposed to. So I don't know if it came because of, I don't believe it was anything that Doug said. I think it's just something that we felt need to be included in. And then when it came on the education property tax, the increment came back from Senate at 80 and 100. The retention. In our discussions, we felt that 70, to more align it with the TIP program that we currently have is probably the right way to go, make it easier for the tax department as well. So we went to adjusted it to what we do on the TIP, which is 70 and 85%. So it doesn't mean that a municipality can't provide 100% of their tax, their municipal tax to the project, but they have to at least provide 85%.
Is somewhere does it say they can go up to 100%?
Yes, it's the not less than.
Yeah, not less than
85%.
85.
Okay, got it.
I had that same question yesterday. Then after I read it again, I said, oh, that was a foolish question, but. We also took a lot of testimony on the retention of funds that at what point does it make sense for monies to flow back into the ed fund if the grand list continues to grow and grow, we're retaining more and more money. What point do you get to taking more money than you need to have? And so we talked a lot about that. And our first thought was that once you know what your indebtedness is, how much your payments are going to be, then the money should flow back maybe the next year. You start and retain some of it. But I think listening to VEPSI and others that it made sense that we kind of mirror what VEPSI does now, where they can adjust those rates of retention. So it could be that in a 10th year, instead of retaining 70%, they may retain 50%. But they can also, if they also need to retain some of those dollars, because in year 20, they may have a 30-year bond, and they may need money to continue to pay that bond down to 30 years if they take a 30-year bond. So what we're saying here is that we're giving that to VEPSI for them to look at, and they shall make those adjustments where they're needed to be adjusted.
Did I remember that it seemed important in original testimony before Ways and Means, seemed important to them. And I understand it, that a practice which I know has occurred in other states, which is multiple bond issues, just because, hey, we can always use more money, particularly with large TIF districts. And as I remember, we indicated we were contemplating, no, here there's an initial bond issue based on a payment generated by a stabilized project. By stabilized, members of the committee, I mean built and occupied. So at that point, the growth of the increment due to that project is now known and established. That the excess would then be either retained by the municipality if it's municipal part, or by the ed fund. That could occur in typically 3 or 4 years, not 10. I mean,
It's possible.
yeah, it's possible.
But I think in a regular TIF, they are able to utilize that extra retaining. They have the extra dollars on other projects. Here you can't. anything you retain at some point has to go back to the ed fund.
Is that how this is intended to work? In other words, because I see that during the 10th year,
Right. Well, that's where we're allowing VEPSI to adjust the percentage of retaining of the amount that they retain. But we also understand that they need to build they need to build excess funds into
if
a
they,
separate fund in case they need to access those for some reason. They haven't captured enough. They haven't captured enough funds in 1 year to make the payment. And also, if they take a longer bond out than 20 years, that they have money there to continue to pay that bond down. But at the 20th year, that's the end. That would be the end of. That's the end of how much they can retain, and at that point, all the money flows back into the ed fund.
you are contemplating, as I understand it, the possibility that they may not issue a 20-year bond, they may issue a 30-year.
Possible.
And that's why I guess it says up to 70% may be retained for up to 20 years. Is the intention there somehow that if there is a 30-year bond, that after the 20th year, money still can be retained as necessary to pay off the bond?
Well, not from the ed fund. So the contemplation is that they're going to retain dollars into a special fund, like an escrow account, that they can then utilize to finish paying the bond off. When the bond is paid off, if there's dollars that are still left, it all goes back into the ed fund. So it can't be retained for any other purpose.
Yeah,
Pay the debt.
right.
Goes back.
I know we'll go into this in more detail, so I won't go too far much further, but just one question is, so let's say we reach stabilization in year 5. And from then on, the growth in the grand list, it's growing. And there's excess, well, let's not even call it excess. There's more municipal tax and more education tax generated. Where does the education tax go at that point?
Go into an escrow account where it's retained at the 10-year period.
Then it's distributed.
Well, then VEPSI will take a look and do all the financial things that they do to make a determination of, can they continue to retain for another 10 years, readjust that amount so that more is going into the ed fund. Or maybe at that point, they could pay it off, but so that's something that VEPSI will have to determine.
Okay, thank you.
The 10 years came from BEPSI. They said, they sometimes know it, the 8-year point, but always by the 10-year point. So that's why we went with that. We had a couple of different ways that we were thinking about it. That's where that came from. Just trying to figure out how to get as much money back to the ed fund, as much money into the ed fund as quickly as possible.
Right. On page 17, these are reports that we're looking for, I think came to us from the Senate. So annually, as projects come on board, to look at the expected or annual sale and rental prices of the housing units and the number of housing units known to be occupied that are other than primary residences. So that's where there's kind of this, there's something that has to be in a contract, but there's also making sure that it's known that somebody's going to be looking at it as well. Make sure that everything adds up. Again, another report, but this is in a 5-year report that we're looking for. We want to know how things are going at the 5-year period. We also want to understand, are there any impediments for municipalities to access the CHIP program? What they are and what are, how do we fix those barriers and make sure that we can provide more access if needed?
My impression, and it's just an impression, was when I first read the draft that came out from the Senate, and I looked at the VEPSI reports, when I looked at the application and what you had to give VEPSI, it looked an awful lot like what I know towns have to give the bond bank to get bond money. If you take testimony or otherwise look at duplication there.
I reached out to, I think, Ron, and he said that the processes are very different and that they should be left separate, so we didn't pursue it.
On 21, I think we went through the CHIP board.
Reminder again, this is only to look at properties that have less than 60% housing, floor plan housing, to give them approval if that municipality sees it as providing meaningful housing to that community. There's a lot that we did in this bill, just as, backing up a little bit, to make sure that this could work in as many towns across the state as possible. And so this is one of those things, because we know that the current TIF districts only work well for for Vermont big towns. We know that the big towns in Vermont aren't that big either. So we wanted this to be something that works across the state.
And then section 21A again is location criteria, what we talked about with, anything that's outside of the 3 approved areas that we have at the moment. So that if they had their Act 250 permit outside of those 3 areas, that they could access the CHIP program. And then the effective date in section 27 is the tier 2 areas.
We're happy to give you an extra 23 pages in your housing bill.
Can I ask a question? Section D on page 22, the location criteria. I probably should have brought it up earlier. I just want to make sure I understand. So if a builder is looking to utilize CHIP, they cannot enter into an agreement with the municipality until all of their permitting is completed. So they can start the agreement before they've completed their permitting.
Yeah, you want to have, the agreement is necessary to go to BEPC.
Yeah,
So you need to be working on that agreement and the
Okay.
permitting probably at the same time.
okay,
Yeah, but what this is saying is that all permits required under 10 VSA, that's the Act 250.
okay,
So we're saying that, they have to have the municipal and all that, and they can work that out.
so this
They
is
can still apply.
truly just for the tier 2.
Exactly.
Okay,
Well, I just want to make sure I'm not sure I understand.
my question, I was understanding.
You want to be able to
Incorrectly.
work on the agreement. There's no limitation when you can work on the agreement. You can work on the agreement before you have your local permits if you want to do that. It's just you got to have it all together, the permits and the draft agreement, but by the time you go to BEPC.
Yeah, but what this is saying is, in order to access CHIP in a tier 2, that right now until 2028, that you already have to have your Act 250 permit. So that means that
So it's a
we'd
way
be
to still
using
move
CHIP to
forward.
incent larger projects that are 10 or more housing units. Until we have the tier 2 mapping done.
But there's no below. There is no limitation on when you start working on or even.
Only your Act
In
250.
fact, the town can enter into a draft can ink it. They just, it's not gonna be, in fact, they have to ink some sort of agreement or subject to VEPC approval.
Except they already have to have their Act 250 permits.
If they're in tier 2,
Yeah.
by the time they get to VEPC.
I think when they apply to the municipality. So this is, if there's anything that's out there now that they're getting an Act 250 permit for in a tier, what's conceived to be a tier 2 area, then those projects can be eligible when CHIP comes online.
So the effective date, 21A takes effect on January 1, 2028.
Correct.
Is the assumption that the effective date of provision of the entire bill?
That'll be in the rest of.
That's okay. So the rest of it,
That's.
yeah, that's just because of that.
Yep.
We can move that to the effective date for section of the whole act. Okay. Cameron's still with me.
I don't think Cameron's been.
Okay. All right. Any questions of these two wonderful people before legislative council takes us through the bill in a little more detail?
I just want to say thank you for working so hard on this and ensuring that we do right by our ed fund, but also ensure that we're putting housing first and making sure it's a priority this year. So I appreciate you even taking the
And
time.
I think this really helps to increase the ed fund.
Yeah.
I really, well, first of all, I just want to tell you that I just appeared before the rural caucus and promised them that almost immediately we would have all the additional financing devices. But seriously, I know because of talking to each of you, but also it's been around the building, how hard you've been working on this. And this is a complicated area. And I think that, for the housing committee, it's kind of a little difficult because housing has so many attributes to it. And so our ability to work really depends entirely on our ability to work with other committees, and it's just been exemplary. So thank you so much for doing all this work on this bill. I mean, it's just obviously essential. So
Well, and thank you. We appreciate that. I think also that workforce, although it's not named in our name, is one of our major pieces as well. And we don't have housing, we don't have workforce. And we already know that because we're suffering.
and if we don't have workforce, we don't have houses, we don't have housing, which is why we had a little bit of workforce, which, by the way, for members of the committee, they knew about. We had a little bit of workforce in our bill, which was stripped out in its wisdom by the Appropriations Committee, but will be revisited. I don't know, it may be back in the Senate, I'm just not sure.
Yeah. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but we straw polled this yesterday. I did. Okay.
No, you didn't mention.
I didn't. It was 11-0. Out of our committee. So. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work on this.
Yeah, thank you.
Really important.
Same.
What are your strengths? Time wise?
On mine, I have to run at 11.
Members of the committee, do we need to take a break or should we just proceed to 11 here?
I think, given John's schedule and the way it has been at the beginning of the week, and I'm assuming the rest of the week, we should just keep going and then break at 11.
John, we had a brief walkthrough of the changes. I think it might be useful for you to take us through the bill.
So good morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Let me find my Zoom link and then I will. Do I have a Zoom link?
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Excuse me, I'm so sorry.
Sorry, that's hilarious.
You only get the blessing for the first one.
That's fair.
No, in Mexico, it's salud, dinero, y amor. You get three. So the first is
Oh.
health, money, and then love.
I don't
Need
need
the last
love.
one. Last one's the hardest to get.
Okay, I want money.
Can I request money?
Sneeze.
Sneeze 3 times.
So that's one of the things I'm guessing, Marcotte and Edie did not talk about is the appropriation I placed for myself.
I was gonna say, wait, there's no free.
Actually, you know, one of the things, John, in all seriousness, let's just skip right to it.
Yep.
This community board that is
Yes.
run out of the
Yes.
treasurer's office.
There is no appropriation for that.
Well, it says compensation
Per diems, yep.
per diems. They're all state employees.
I don't know how League of Cities and Towns works or how the compensation for bond bank works, but you're correct that for the ones we definitively know, you would just look to the statute and they're likely to be covered separately by the salaries that they receive. That's what that particular section calls out.
Yes.
And then you could have, depending on the compensation structure for bond bank and VLCT, you potentially could have an appropriation there. So that would be, once there's a fiscal note available, you maybe.
Yes, well, the only reason I bring it up is this bill will go to appropriation. Because it once had appropriations in it, at the very least. Don't they always add a little caveat that says, yeah, but only to the extent money is appropriated?
Sometimes what we do is we have language to specify where the sources of funds will be for the per diem. I haven't been asked to draft something that limits it to what is appropriate, but of course, practically that is the case. You wouldn't have it if you don't. They would technically be entitled to a per diem under the language, right? They are meant to be paid out as described in the section. Just a second, I'm going to screen share.
I just know that we left in 127. I don't want to take a long time.
Yeah.
Just
And were you on approach last year? Is that?
yes, I was. Just a minute here. No, where is it? Well, I'll find it, but there's language that we left in for another per diem. Oh, I guess,
127.
yeah, it was, I think it was on the,
Universal design.
it was on the universal design study. Just a second.
One thing I would expect in a fiscal note on this is that we don't know the number of meetings that this board will have.
Right, that's right.
Based on the demand, exactly. So it would be hard potentially to even calculate what you would require for this, but hopefully much of it is covered just by salary.
Okay, you should just at one point look at subsection H on the universal design study.
Okay,
It just says intent to appropriate
okay.
language. Notwithstanding, per diems shall only be available to the extent that blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
And I guess the only question is,
Do we?
probably Cameron is gonna be, you're gonna be working with Cameron on generating the final version of this.
Yes,
And the question simply is, do you need to stick it here as well?
for sure. And we can do that if you guys want. The way that I've understood this process is that House Commerce was submitting this language proposal
Yes,
to you guys.
that's right.
You could, of course, do something, and then it sounds like House Environment may as well be.
Yeah, we can. Are you nicely telling me, why don't you take care of that?
I can nicely tell other people in the office to do.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Great, thank you. All right.
I like that. Do you guys want to talk in the draft? We've obviously done a walkthrough of the program. Do you want me to hit the highlighted changes again, which are those highlights against what the Senate sent across? That will have been presumably what you just heard described, but I could go back through them so that maybe it would make more sense. I know sometimes just getting the information twice. Or however you want to proceed. I just know that if I do a full scale walkthrough, you'll recall it took me like 3 hours to.
That's right. I think we should look at the changes and the intent behind them.
Yep. So I think one helpful way, before I scroll to the highlighted changes, to think about some of the updates that you're going to see is related to the purpose section. You'll recall that the purpose section, as the bill came across, as the CHIP proposal came across in S-127, was to stimulate the development of primary residences for low to moderate income families. But there wasn't a lot substantively in the draft that would infer that that actually is achieved, right? It was in the purpose section, which is included into some of the analysis to what constitutes an improvement, but there weren't pieces beyond saying you need to include housing in your development to really get at that particular piece. And there was nothing to really speak to low to moderate income beyond that purpose. So you can think of some of the changes that you're going to see here as related to trying to build out in statute, achieving that purpose. So the first thing that you see at the bottom of page 1 is updating the definition of housing development. This looks like a wholesale change of the definition. This was previously construction of one or more buildings. It's not a wholesale change. What has really been done here is some slight stylistic change to make sure that you pick up any building that occurs on the housing development site so that someone couldn't satisfy the criterion by just having one small development placed on the site and then have other development they're doing not picked up. And the more substantive change is instead of just having construction of a building, which could just be new construction, you see rehabilitation or renovation of any building. This is trying to get at producing housing, not just through new construction, but also through the rehabilitation or renovation of existing structures that would be permissible under this approach.
I think Rep. Booton was concerned, so he's from Barry, and with all the flooding, and I think one of the things that he had brought up was putting housing on
Exactly.
belts, and so that kind of encompasses that concern.
I think that this particular language was an attempt to address his concern.
Okay,
And there's another piece we'll come to that's related to that as well.
thank you.
Lenore?
Yeah, I just wondered, was there intent to? Do we need any language that kind of says, that? Does the housing have to be for it to qualify for rehabilitation or renovation? Does it have to be like uninhabitable currently?
There is no restriction of that kind, right? And there had been in commerce, there are some fairly significant changes, even within like intraday changes in drafts. And I think we ended up with this 5.2 is what you see here. And there had been some attempts to try to get at this achieving habitability type piece, not on this part, but there was an attempt to restrict the definition of improvements to be the minimal infrastructure that would be required to achieve habitability. And we found it conceptually difficult to delineate that line, right? Like intuitively, it makes sense. That is what you're trying to do, is to encourage the kind of infrastructure that is just required to make a project possible. But you start entering into these but-for type tests or trying to, I think the reason you haven't seen something like that, or you won't see something like that in this draft, relates to practical implementation. But to your exact question, there is no restriction here to say that the rehabilitation that is permissible is exclusive to something that is uninhabitable. It could be something that is currently habitable and made better or different. So
that would be like stilts, for an example. You can technically still live in a house that's on the ground,
Right.
but within a flood zone, if you're gonna still it, it's.
It's like current or future habitability. Yeah.
Question here on this.
Mhm.
I appreciate defining housing development, but I haven't had the opportunity to do is figure out how it's used.
Yeah.
As I understand it, by saying any building on a housing development site, it means that housing development includes like a commercial structure on a housing development.
What it's trying to do is pick up every
Everything
construction that happens on the development site and subject it to the project criterion, which relates, we'll come to that, but it's trying to make sure that you can't just slot a building on the housing development site and subject that to the constraints of the program, and then have a bunch of other buildings on a large parcel, for instance, that don't have to satisfy it. That's why any is used here. And just to call out for the group's benefit, when we're defining terms, often folks will think, oh, housing development, this should be an intuitive concept. It's literally just the housing. We're creating technical terms that plug into a machine that is meant to subject them to particular standards. So it is, if it feels weird, part of why it feels that way is you're just trying to make sure that the right thing is subject to the correct standards. And
I understand
Yeah.
the need for clear definitions. There isn't a definition of housing development site.
so the housing development site, if we go down to the way to think about this is it's kind of defined in two places. The definition section calls out what you should reference when you think about this. So it says on page 2, the parcel or parcels encompassing that housing development. So whatever those buildings are as authorized by a muni pursuant to section 1908. But if you look at section 1908, and I'm just going to call out the concept rather than showing you the page, it's the site on which your housing development is being built and any immediately adjoining parcels. And if you're looking for the language that says that, it's in section 1908. And we'll scroll past that so I can point it out when we get to it.
One last question that you may find, you can tell me, I'll get to it. So as I think I mentioned to you, Plainfield, for example, is choosing not to build the house. They're doing that development because flooding took out so many houses. So they're moving a portion of the downtown. They're doing the subdivision. They'll need infrastructure to serve the subdivision. They want to sell the lots and let individuals build the houses. And many of them will be tiny houses or other very inexpensive
Yeah.
houses. And I just want to make sure that they could access.
So it is,
In other words, people often don't build the vertical houses. They want to subdivide and then take it from there.
so I think there's two pieces that complicate that attempt. So the first thing I'll address is subdivision is a permissible kind of improvement in the first place, right? Site preparation, that's a permissible kind of improvement that you could finance with tax increment financing. But part of what is required for the programs to work is that you have set up this housing infrastructure agreement with a developer to provide the actual designated housing development. So one thing is if you don't know upfront what the housing is going to be, then you can't have an agreement with someone as to installing that housing. So you would be out of the game on that basis. You have to have at the point of
The
application.
municipality could be the sponsor. And it
Municipality could be the sponsor, but you still need someone who is creating the housing. So theoretically, what I would say is if you had a group of folks who are saying, we're going to create housing on these sites, you would need to set up an agreement amongst all of them to say that is what's happening. And then you could finance your agreed infrastructural improvements. So it could be infrastructure, classic infrastructure, or it could be subdivision as a kind of site preparation, right? But you just need to know that housing is being created on those places. The other part I would say that might complicate this arrangement is we still have this construction, rehabilitation, or renovation. So I think it's arguable that you could say you're constructing something when you're putting housing on the site, but I could see someone quibbling over that argument. So to me, there's two complexities there. I don't know that I have the definitive answer to it. I think that could be a hard thing to pull off because you need to have the folks who are creating the housing available at the point of agreement, which is pre-application. And then you also need to fall within the category of construction, rehabilitation, or renovation. So that's.
I'll just say, I understand that maybe the financing might want to know, from a financing perspective, you might want to know what kind of development is going on the site. From a low-income housing perspective, a municipality as the sponsor could provide, by regulation, that the housing has to comply with all of those requirements.
Sure. I just mean to say that the way that the program is structured is that you are going in knowing exactly what you're getting. It really is a project-based approach to TIF as opposed to TIF districts, which are waiting for kinds of development to occur. This is, you go in with a plan. This is the infrastructure I'm doing. This is how I finance it. And this is the housing development that's being produced, meaning actual buildings, not just setting up for buildings to come, right? So you have to go in knowing what you're doing. Presumably, new conditions could arise and you could talk to Pepsi and, modify your plans, but it's unlike a TIF district, which is a broad location which accommodates all kinds of different projects. It is, you're going in knowing.
Can I ask a ridiculous question that I should know and I'm now just like spiraling in my own head? So section 1908, how you described it is a parcel or an adjoining parcel, correct?
Mhm.
When we're talking about infrastructure, there's a possibility that you might own this parcel, there's a parcel in between, and then there's one on the other side that would be part of the project.
So,
Would that still be okay under this?
so the way to think about it is the housing development site is agnostic as to where the infrastructure is located, right? The infrastructure can be separated from the housing development site.
Perfect.
And so the site, what it's going to pick up is just where the housing is going in, plus any immediately adjoining parcels. And the reason for that is in part to ensure that you pick up an increment, right? Like a sufficient increment, because think about this is it's a much smaller, theoretically, geographic area than you would have for a TIF district. And you're trying to ensure that you generate sufficient increment to actually contribute in a meaningful way toward your financing. But yeah, the infrastructure can be separate. Infrastructure could be blocks and blocks, could be miles, yeah.
Like the whole, perfect. I just wanted to make sure we're all set there.
Yes,
I just want to make sure I understand correctly. It was said that the contract and permit needs to be in place before you can access CHIP.
It doesn't have to be. And I can jump to where that is if that is helpful.
please.
Um,
I know this is a little chaotic, but we did have sort of.
yeah, no, this is cool. I like this way of doing it. That way I don't waste time on less meaningful pieces. So we're talking about the location criteria. And so we're on the bottom of page 8, and I'm gonna resume my screen share. You'll see on line 19 the start of location criteria.
Mhm.
I'm going to briefly skip past the highlighted language, which is what is most responsive to your question, just to set the stage, and then I'll come back to the highlighted language. So traditionally, VETSI is looking for TIF districts. They look at particular location criteria, right? And you have the same structure here, but for the highlighted language, which I'll talk about. So VETSI is to review under this subsection the housing development site to determine whether it's located within an area designated Tier 1A or Tier 1B, or an area exempt from the provisions of that chapter, or an existing settlement. So those are your two location criteria at the outset. There is a future effective expansion to Tier 2, so we'll come to that at the end of the bill. But those are your location criteria. Next is the highlighted language, which is at the top of page 9. It says, provided that a housing development for which all permits required under Act 250 have been secured as of the time of application, so when they come into the door, shall be deemed to have satisfied the location criteria of this subsection. What it means is if you came in the door with your Act 250 permits in plan as required for your project, you don't have to fall into these buckets. You can build anywhere. If you come in the door with your permits in hand at the point of application, location criteria don't apply to you. That's the way to think about
Oh, it's
this.
not just Tier 2.
It's not just Tier 2. This is today, from the start of I say today, July 1, 2025, which is incredibly close. At the point that the project is, at the point that the program is in place, if you have all your permits in place, you have to meet the remainder of this section. It's not as if you don't have to meet the process requirements or the project criterion, but you don't have to meet the location criteria if you come in with Act 250 permits, all the Act 250 permits secured for your project.
What is it that takes effect on July 1, 2028?
That is the expansion to include Tier 2 as one of the location criteria. And the effect in relationship to these is location criteria in conjunction with this, you can think about them as what is required for someone who doesn't come in the door with all of their Act 250 permits required. They have to fall into one of these buckets. And so in 2028, a new bucket would be made available. They could pursue a project in Tier 2, even if they didn't start from day one with their Act 250.
Where is that?
Final pages of
Yeah.
the bill. I can jump to it if it's.
The last.
Well, I know 21A, okay, okay.
And I will pull it up on screen too. Yeah, so. Why 21A? I've seen the template.
21A becomes effective in 2028.
That's right, January 1, 2028. And to talk about the date itself, there had initially been a proposal to have this as a contingently effective date, contingent upon 1 year following the first designation of an area as tier 2, meaning we were trying to space this out so that the legislature would have time to review the potential impacts of opening this up to tier 2. But in talking with my colleague Ellen, some of the thinking was that you could theoretically make the argument that tier 2 designations already exist, because what they are is they fill in whatever is not the other tiers. And so to ensure that you don't have that problem, we just created a date that is 1 year out from the earliest date I have heard described as when maps might be available, which is the start of 27. But I don't know when that's, and you could, if you get better information on tier 2 in the next session, you could of course amend this future effective date.
So if you have an Act 250 permit, you can avail yourself of CHIPS, regardless of whether you're in tier 1A, 1B, tier 2, or tier 3.
Exactly. And part of while this is not my area of expertise at all, something I keep reminding committees, and I think it's very clear in this room, but just to state it, these are independent regimes, right? Like this is speaking to the financing, and Act 250 is speaking to the permitting. So you're not trying to build in some requirement that folks have a new process. So presumably the fact that you have secured Act 250 permits means you're building in an appropriate way for that area. I mean, that's at least theoretical.
Right, and we've created this sort of 2020 effective in 2028. We've added anywhere in tier 2. Presumably, if the legislature wants to, it can narrow that or otherwise deal with it. But at the moment, if we did nothing, starting July 1, 2020, January 1, 2028, tier 2 is open as well.
Tier 2 is open, and if you came in without Act 250 permits, you could still get through the TIP application process. Yep.
Okay. Please.
Question. So, and I know Chair Marcotte had said this isn't a perfect bill. I actually have some concern over this aspect. But I think, so my understanding is a majority of the state, and maybe this is an Ellen question, or I know Commissioner Farrell is coming in, but a majority of the state is actually considered under tier 2, or we're assuming it's going to be under tier 2 without the maps. But my understanding of what tier 2 is that it would hypothetically be tier 1, A or B, should it have wastewater and sewer?
Yeah, I don't know. But I have heard this same thing, that if you have tier 2 built in, you have tier 1A and tier 1B available, you're talking about potentially quite wide swaths of the state, at which point you might ask, why even have location criteria if you're just covering, like, why make that a restriction, right? If you're just making it available.
I mean, I wouldn't mind that. I'm sure there are other people in this body who would. That being said, would it be a possibility, and it would be a committee discussion to discuss maybe putting language in here, if we're going to keep this location criteria, that should the project be establishing wastewater or sewer, it could be considered tier 1 or A or B? Like, how could we include language similar to that?
You see,
I'm really concerned that, I mean, we're in the middle of a housing crisis yesterday, and the 2028 deadline is not sufficient for me.
Are you asking for like a similar approach as to what is being done for the Act 250 permitting, where those folks are deemed to have satisfied the location criteria, meaning if their project is installing wastewater, sewer, they don't have to meet the location criteria, basically? Like, that's the way I understand the request. So it would look a lot like the proviso that you have for,
Yeah,
it would look a lot like this, except it would say provided that
I mean,
housing development.
you are the attorney and you know what that language would look like, but would that be a possibility? Would it make it super confusing?
You guys can do whatever you want. I mean, that's.
Tell me that.
I don't personally want you to do whatever you want because it will hurt my life, but you can choose to do that and it would look like this. And it will be more complicated in language.
Yeah.
It is achievable if that is something that people wanted to do. It does start to raise the question, like what are the location criteria for if we start
Right.
accepting all these kinds of things?
Well, I have to say, logically, the same thing occurred to me right away. In other words, and it's not just because of the nature of tier 1A and tier 1 and tier 2. It's because the criteria for being in tier 1 is that you have to have either, wastewater or sandy soils, and that's 1B. And the whole point of this is to get you wastewater. So if you're going to be, in other words, I think she's suggesting bootstrapping, why make people actually go through the whole Act 250 process when the point of the infrastructure is to make them as if they were in tier 1?
And I also just want to
Yeah, I
say,
mean, I don't think it's tier 3. I think it would be somebody who's probably adjacent to or very close to an area, but not in it right now. But they would have been in it, they would have been mapped in it, and they will be mapped in it if the infrastructure is in place. That's the,
and I think just, for myself to add, one of the reasons I had originally introduced this language in the House was because we know that TIF doesn't work for small communities who need more capacity with their municipalities. And I think it's unreasonable to think that really, really rural communities are already going to have an Act 250 permit for 10 units of housing when they're just trying to put in 2, and 2 might be sufficient to what they need. And so that might be a committee discussion. I just wanted to know
It is.
if it's possible or what that might look
If
like.
there's a way to do it. You just eliminate the location criteria for that particular purpose.
Okay.
And the thing I might offer as a nuance, which isn't at all rebutting what you're saying, but just to expand on, there's the description that this is to create sewage or water. I just wanted to note that I think the committee knows the definition of improvements is much more broad than that. So people are pursuing other things through this program. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think just from our conversations last year, that's where tier 2 was defined as different than tier 1 A and B, or that's what I'm remembering. So if we're saying that that's what's differing, and one project is like saying, yeah, we're going to put this in. Sorry, this can be a committee discussion.
Yeah.
And I think for this piece, it may be helpful to have Ellen.
Okay.
right. So just for your purposes, if we wanted to expand the location criteria such that a 2-tier project that would have sewer and water with the contemplated infrastructure development via the financing device would in fact meet the location criteria. It would be just a question of trying to pick the words.
And I would really think of it as just not subjecting to the location criteria a project that is pursuing those particular infrastructural improvements,
Right.
because we wouldn't have anything to call out, at least as of today, which is the concern, right? Is that in the rollout, we wouldn't have anything to call out tier 2 as of today. So what we would just say is, provided that the improvements for the housing infrastructure project include sewage or wastewater, shall be deemed to have satisfied the location criteria. This subsection, that is what it would sound like.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Just so
Yes.
maybe this is more of a policy question, but is there anything in the bill that would, or in the tier, which I don't understand as deeply as I want to, that would prevent the ship to be accessed by just somebody who's building a McMansion in, really far from
Well, that's
the
the low
current
income housing issue,
infrastructure.
which he's going to get to. We'll
Okay,
get to that.
all right.
I can talk about some of the pieces that I can scroll through and try to find pieces that hit that. You're correct that Let me just look at the project criterion so you can see that or the criteria, and then we can talk about that broader concept. So I have up on the screen and we're on page 8, the project criteria. So just note that an application has to meet a couple of different requirements, right? Process requirements, the location criteria we were just talking about, and then additionally one of these project criteria. So you'll have heard the new,
It's just one of the project criteria, correct?
just one of the project criteria. You don't have to meet both. And the second is actually an alternative. So the first of these, BEPC to review a muni's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether at least 60% of the gross floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing, and the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907 of this title. That sub B, that it furthers the purposes of section 1907, speaks to your specific concern. And this was added yesterday in House Commerce. This is an effort to have BEPC make a determination that this is part of simulating the development of primary residences for low to moderate income. And there's another determination required by the municipality at the point that it forms its housing development plan. So multiple inputs to say that's the consideration that went into this, but there isn't a restriction to say there's no affordability criterion in place. The second project criteria, which is available if you can't meet this 60% floor area requirement, or if BEPC determines that it doesn't further the purposes, right? For instance, BEPC might look at a project that's creating entirely mansions for out-of-state folks. They might say, oh, you don't meet the proposal here. BEPC under sub 2, if BEPC determines that a project meets all of the requirements of the application, meaning they meet the process requirements and the location criteria, but they don't meet this sub 1, meaning they don't meet the 60 plus that it furthers the purposes of the subchapter, they would reach out to this newly stood up board to ask them to make a determination whether the projected housing development will meaningfully address the housing needs of the community. So in any avenue you take, if you take the first avenue, you have to have a municipal and BEPC determination that it's furthering the purposes of the subchapter. If you're not falling under that route, you can't meet the 60% threshold, for instance, the board has to make a determination that projected housing development meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community. So those would be natural places where you might catch a project that's trying to fly through doing something like that. And in any event, there's other stages in which pressure would be applied. They're in less traditional ways you might think of as restrictive, but note that there's a political process as well, right? Like when you're rolling out these applications, there have to be public hearings on the agreement, on the project description and the like. So there's avenues for folks to voice opposition to what is happening. And if the municipality is the sponsor, the voters could vote not. They can vote no on incurring indebtedness for something. So
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just a technical thing. I assume that your intention here is that BEPC is reviewing all this stuff. But the idea is they don't approve it if it doesn't meet this criteria.
that's right. And I can show you, I included a really simple subsection on this. BEPC may approve, and then we're on page 7, sub B. BEPC may approve only applications that meet process requirements, either of the project criteria, that's all we just talked about, whether you get that 60% or you make the board determination, and either the location criteria. And then we have the sunsetting as well, December 31st.
So to determine whether is okay, it doesn't have to determine that. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that is a fair, like, linguistic thing to point out, like, should it be? I think everyone knows, but I could see someone saying, well, they determined whether it did, and what they determined is that it didn't.
Yeah.
But they made it. But here it's saying that you meet the project criteria, right? That's what we see in sub B, is that it meets the process requirements, either project criteria. So I could see a lawyer attempting to make that argument. I don't think it's a great argument, but I would try if I was on that side.
You could say determine that.
Yeah, exactly. You could, yeah.
All right.
Can I ask for a favor? It would be beneficial to me, and while I understand we're kind of walking through this language, could you really quickly bring up section 1907 and just walk through the purpose?
Yes.
Thank you.
So we are on page 4. The purpose of housing infrastructure tax increment financing is to provide revenues for improvements and related costs to encourage the development of primary residences for households of low or moderate income. So nice to remind the committee this is the purpose, but I wonder if part of what your question is trying to get at is the way in which a housing development itself can be thought of as meeting the purposes. If you think the purpose is exclusively being about generating revenues, like I can see that argument, and I will say we didn't revise the purpose to when we pulled in that language yesterday afternoon. I think you could make this clear to say that the purpose of the housing infrastructure tax increment financing is to create primary residences for households of lower and moderate income and like cut out this provide revenues for improvements and related costs. I don't think anyone's going to struggle to understand what is meant by this, but you could tighten it up in that way. And just to call out where this language came from about provide revenues for improvements and related costs, this is the way that we talk about the purpose of the TIF subchapter in Title 24.
I would actually,
Okay.
I really appreciate you going through that. I think it's helpful. Do we have, and I think not necessarily for myself, but when this comes to the floor and other members, do we have a definition of low or moderate income?
We do not.
Is that something that, again, this might be a committee discussion, but just to bring up, like, put a pin in it, is that something that we should be defining in this? Or do you think, I guess I'm asking for your
Yeah.
opinion too, do you think it's okay as is?
So the reason I think it's great to have specificity as to what you want to achieve. So if folks think that it will boost clarity as to what the purpose of the program is by spelling out those categories, then I say go for it. But I would note that because there is no affordability criterion, right? We don't have some mandated, right? If you had language here to say we're trying to create something that makes this affordable to at 30% of the income of someone at low to moderate income, it would be very necessary then to call out what that is.
I think we will have that through testimony. There are, in fact, any number of sort of key terms in this sentence.
Primary residences, yeah.
Well, I think the first is encourage. That's probably the biggest wiggle room in there. On the other hand, it does allow mixed use development. I mean, if we just said,
Oh, for sure.
we scratched out to encourage and we said related to development of lower moderate income, that would mean we were essentially saying that's all it can be used for is low and moderate income, which would be in fact stricter than saying it has to be 20% or something like that. Encourage does allow mixed use.
Yeah.
I suppose it could allow more, and we'll discuss that here.
It absolutely does. I mean, you would be encouraging the development of primary residences if you created one. I mean, I don't see there's nothing about this that is hurting a mixed use project. And the thing that does limit the mixed use is your floor requirement or that board determination that it be serving the needs of the community. Those are the things that restrict how much can be
Although the low mod is not part of the that committee's jurisdiction, it's only the 60%, right?
The board would not, the board would.
Let's see that other.
Yeah, the board would specifically be called on when, most likely when someone doesn't meet the 60%. So they don't have to think about the 60%. And I would say it will be natural for the board when it asks the question, does this meaningfully address the housing needs of the community, to think about this purpose? If I was on the board, it would be a natural thing I would think about. But they can make a determination. That is meant to be intentionally general language to allow the board to say, look, we recognize that this might not meet conventional standards but by assessing the context of the project itself and the community itself, we're saying we do think this is a meaningful addition to the housing of this area. And they wouldn't necessarily have to think about 1907, but it would be a natural thing to think about.
Right. Although I do see, I didn't understand before. If you look at page 8. You could call it page 8.
Yep.
If you look at page 8 under project criteria,
Mhm.
D1 is two different criteria.
Exactly.
It's the 60% and it's the purposes of 1907, okay? The two gives the the,
Board, yep.
uh,
The council requests the chip board to determine.
yeah, if it doesn't meet either of those two. If it doesn't, if it doesn't meet A or doesn't meet B.
Right.
That's right. This would come in if you can't satisfy sub one, and the only way you can satisfy sub one is by meeting both A and
Right,
B.
B. So if it's 60%, if it's 100% housing, so it meets A,
Mhm.
but it doesn't have any low income housing. Then it doesn't meet B. Then it goes to the board. And the board's criteria is the housing needs of the community.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a fallback. I mean, I just want to get this clear what this draft is.
That's right. It's an alternative. You could describe it as an alternative route, but the way that it came about was thinking about what do we do about projects that may be at the threshold? What do we do about projects that may not make it in under a strict percentage requirement, but that we know mean something to the communities that would receive them? That's what this is like a backup for those to get in the door.
I think a good example that's been used is Memorial Auditorium. I think they're coming in at roughly 50% commercial, 50% housing.
Yeah,
So obviously, projects like that will absolutely benefit the community and provide through like our real housing needs.
right.
So that's been one of the ones that has been talked
Right,
about.
I understand. I was under the illusion, and I was wrong, that the board and its criteria have only jurisdiction over under D1A, but that's not true. They have jurisdiction over D1A and B. And so a board is looking at the question of whether you meet low-income housing, and the board has no one on who is anyway connected with housing. They're all financial.
The board is only contacted if someone can't meet either of 1A or 1B.
Right, yeah,
And then at that point, the determination they make is they just ask this one question: does it meaningfully address the housing needs of the community?
Right.
That's the extent of what they talk about. And they might talk about the proposed section 1907.
Right.
I will say too, in my question to Chair Marcotte, when I had asked about the RPCs, he said that the RPCs do have a member on the BEPC board.
right,
So there is somebody who at least has that
right,
lens.
okay.
Um,
So, I mean, at this point, we're trying to understand. I think I now understand this. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I understand.
Let me throw one more piece in related to this. So on page 4,
Yeah,
section 1908 is how a municipality creates its project and housing development site. We talk about the process they have to do, going through things like a housing development plan, HIP financing plan, creating a map that describes the geographic area. There's been one addition to the housing development plan on page 5, which speaks to this same piece. You'll see the highlighted language on line 8, or on page 5, line 8. The housing development plan that a municipality is putting together to start its process to create this project would include a determination that the proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907. So at the outset, the municipality has to make this determination that they've thought about how this stimulates primary residences for low to moderate income folks and build that into their housing development plan. And that would be available to BEPC in the application. So there's multiple stages at which this determination is made.
right.
And that therefore also must be part of the regional plan?
I'm not sure I follow, but it may just be my lack of familiarity with the, are you asking if this has to be consistent with so I don't know that I know the best answer to this, but I might bring up, and I may be misunderstanding the question, I might bring up just the multiple regulatory regimes. Like this is speaking to the financing piece, but for someone to get something actually running, they still have to meet any independent land use requirements, right? That's not thrown out by being in the TIP program. So you're not going to get if you can't satisfy those pieces, you've just gone through the whole TIP application process for no reason, because it's not going to be able to be built. Is that responsive or did I misunderstand?
Yep, no,
But it is to say that we have typically not built into TIF things related to Act 250 because they really are just independent pieces. You have to meet both and you don't have to speak to both. Which is part of the oddity of including that proviso that takes you out of the location criteria, as we have not up to this point kind of integrated that kind of consideration into the finance.
Go ahead, please.
Did you say that there's no definition for low and moderate?
There is no definition, and what I was trying to articulate is that you could have something like that if the committee finds it helpful to do that, to spell out what the purposes of the piece are. I was just going to say that technically you would feel more need for that in a construct where you had some definition of affordable housing that is based on like 30% of what those incomes are. So then you would need to know 30% of what, right? In this case, you're kind of speaking more generally about a broad purpose of the subchapter, which is, are we creating primary residences for those folks? Now, if you think that people are going to characterize this in really loose ways, then I would encourage you to think about what that category might be. But I think that the committee felt comfortable, the Commerce felt comfortable without.
We
But doesn't-
we will in the testimony that we're going to hear soon have people proposing specific definitions of low and moderate income housing.
So doesn't HUD have a definition?
Oh, folks, there may be independent entities that have this, but we haven't built in a subchapter specific definition of these pieces. And maybe that is an important point to note. When we use a term like low income, we don't automatically pick up what a federal definition might be. We would have to specifically call that out. So we aren't picking up anything technical here. If we wanted to do that, we would need to affirmatively do so.
Thank you.
Let's see if there's. Yeah. Oh, yes. One other piece I think just worth highlighting for you guys, the housing infrastructure agreement. We are on page 6. So this is kind of trying to set out a basic framework for the contractual negotiation that would happen among the municipality, the developer, and potentially a third-party sponsor. That may not always be the case. And what we had before were kind of bare bones pieces, identifying the sponsor, the developer, the housing development. Step 3 is a pretty meaningful part of this. This is making sure that you only obligate the tax increments for financing and related costs, meaning if you're providing financing to that sponsor, you're only going to send across the amount of increment. You're not requiring the voters to take on some additional responsibility. But the new language you have is this sub 4, which does speak to the purpose we've been talking about so much in 1907. This is providing terms to ensure that any housing unit within the development be offered exclusively as a primary residence until all indebtedness for that housing infrastructure project incurred during the incursion period is retired. So this means for the life of the financing, these could be offered only as primary residences. And the way that this is general language, it does not prescribe the process by which the muni and a developer would achieve this outcome. But the talks that we've been having and the thinking is that you could ask for covenants to be built into these when these units are sold to ensure that they're only available on this.
How would you feel about language which said that?
That said specifically that?
I understand that the theory here is let's not be too prescriptive about what goes into the contract. But how would you feel about language which said that the contract between the developer or the project sponsor and whatever, whoever it is, the contract shall specify, the means shall specify how this is carried out and enforced?
I mean, I think that is required by 4, providing the terms. I agree that you could be more specific and just to offer, there's one selfish aspect of this, and then there's one non-selfish aspect of it. So I'll start with the non-selfish. The non-selfish is the way I've tried to draft this section is to have the kind of most minimal language that you could do so that you're not constraining parties to contractual negotiations. So that's the thing.
That's good.
That's the thinking there. The selfish part, which is related to that, which is I just don't have the expertise or sufficient time to I don't mean from like a putting it in language, but giving you helpful understanding of the avenues by which you could achieve this. I have not had sufficient time or, I would say I didn't want to over determine what happens here because I would envision that those folks will have better sense as to the process for achieving this. But the reason you might consider modifying this is if you think that there's a great risk that municipalities aren't going to adequately protect themselves. And I do think that is a good reason to think about changing this. But to me, this is a pretty clear general way of describing, like, you need to make sure that you have something that contractually obligates these only to be offered as primary residences. And the negotiating parties can figure out what that is.
I think for me, it would be, I'm thinking of something as simple as, if you look at the language, provide terms, and I would just add, and sufficient remedies.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yes, you could do that. Yeah.
General question is, at some point in the last 3 months, this has come up in conversation. Is it possible for a municipality using whatever tool you're employing here for to, under a covenant or some other way, to designate workforce, to designate as a priority public service employees, so fire, teachers, nurses, the things that we do have shortages, and are they able to do that?
So I think you're, well, this is interesting. So there could be two questions here. One could be, just, is that theoretically possible under the program here? Could a municipality negotiate in its agreement to have its own kind of covenants that are not contemplated by the program? Yes. This section is not exhaustive as to what the municipality can do in the housing infrastructure agreement. It just says you need to meet these safeguards. So as long as you meet these safeguards, you can still negotiate for other things in the agreement. So theoretically, you could do that. The other question you could have is, do you want to prescribe terms along these lines in this program? But I think the first answer is probably more responsive, which is just, yes, the municipality can negotiate in this process for what it wants, as long as it's not violating other conditions of the program. The section is not exhaustive as to what the agreement will be. It just says you need to meet these things. Yeah. Which is also part of why when folks have asked for this language to include things like a clear pledge by the municipality that they're doing particular things, it's like, you can do that in the contractual negotiating, but you don't have to spell it out in statute. That can be done.
Yes.
Would this hinder building housing for home ownership? Does that make sense?
How do you mean?
It doesn't have to be the individual building. You know what? Never mind. Sorry. I'm just talking out loud.
This is, well, but it is all buried in the encourage language in what the encourage language means in this, in 1907, in the purpose section. I know what you're getting at. And actually, I think Tom's question is about that really too.
Okay.
I mean, the reality is we're going to hear testimony on this, but it's perfectly possible. It's one thing if you have a requirement that 20% of the housing be defined low mod when there's subsidy available.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no subsidy available, someone's putting together 6 housing units, and you're telling them one of those housing units has to be affordable to low mod, that means the subsidy will come from inside the project, which will raise the price of the other housing units. So, that's a reality. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying there's all kinds of questions there, including really, Tom, I think buried in your question is, what if a town really wants to aim at kind of low middle income, which is workforce? What does that mean? And how do we do that? Would we ever see a situation where insisting on very low income in a project would mean there isn't enough money to meet low middle income? These are realities of these housing projects. And this, as it's written, is agnostic on that, other than a general.
Exactly.
I would say it's safe to say the Commerce Committee has elected for a kind of a general standard rather than a specific standard. And we can discuss, I think we will discuss that more with coming testimony.
I would agree, and I would offer to, I think it's easy when you have a proposal in front of you to start thinking of it as the only thing that exists in the space, but this is just a tool for reducing the cost for a particular project. It's not going to solve every kind of housing problem. You're trying to decide the scope of the problem that it can help ameliorate. And I am going to have to run like
Okay.
now, so I don't know.
John, thank you very much. I know that we have various witnesses here. We're going to testify next, mainly Alex and Polly, if we can get through them. But I hope you will realize that there will be a better concentration on your testimony if we take a break at this point. Could everyone be back here as quickly as possible? I'd like to begin at absolutely begin